Our story will start in the summer of 1730, when a group of prominent men led by James Oglethorpe and John Percival, later the Earl of Egmont, petitioned the King of England for a tract of land on the southwest of Carolina for settling poor persons of London. A charter was granted on June the 9th of 1732, creating 21 trustees for the establishing of Georgia. Georgia was granted the lands between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers, and lines were drawn from their headwaters to the Pacific Ocean. In November of 1732, sailing from Gravesend, England, on board the frigate Anne, James Oglethorpe and a little over 100 settlers set out to establish the new colony in Georgia, southwest of Carolina. On February the 12th of 1733, the group landed at Yamacraw Bluff. On a high sandy bluff overlooking the river, Savannah and Georgia were founded. 157 years after the historical landing at Yamacraw Bluff, and 25 years after the Civil War and Sherman's march through Georgia, a small town some 90 miles inland was founded. The year was 1890, and the new town was named Vidalia. This video is a look into Vidalia's past with the aid of old photographs, documents, and interviews. It is not intended as a complete history, but rather a small glimpse into its past. We want to share the old photographs, documents, and historical information submitted by interested individuals with others interested in Vidalia's past and celebrating its 100th birthday. 1990 marks Vidalia's Centennial. We will begin our journey into the past by interviewing two local historians, Kitty Martin Peterson and Moses M. Coleman, Jr. These two individuals will help us look back into Vidalia's early years prior and up to its founding in 1890. Catherine Martin Peterson, formerly Sarah Catherine Martin, was born in Thomas County, Georgia, growing up in Waycross. Catherine Martin later married a native of the area and former postmaster, Fred Peterson. Most know Mrs. Peterson as Kitty, a name that was given to her when she was a radio announcer in New York City during World War II. Kitty Peterson has been writing a column in the weekly newspaper, the Vidalia Advance, for years, writing of Vidalia's history and other interesting events that have occurred in Vidalia's past. We talked in length with Kitty Peterson concerning information she has gathered over the years on Vidalia's early history.
Here in the Vidalia Advance and the off and on in the line's progress since 1970, I get a lot of calls from people for information, particular college students and high school students who are writing papers on this town. And the questions that are asked most often are, how old is Vidalia and where did Vidalia get its name? And I'm sorry to tell you, nobody seems to know the answer to either of those questions. But I can say that Vidalia is a lot older than 100 years. That's when the town was named, but there were people here long before that. You might not know this, but I have a copy of a map in here that shows that we had Spanish missions as early as 1578 and 79 down along the river. And then we had, after the Revolutionary War, a lot of the veterans drew land in the land lottery of that period, and they moved into this area, but most of them settled along the Altamaha River because this was backwoods. These were the country crackers that lived back up in here. According to this book by Lucian Lamar Knight, the Georgia's Landmarks, Memorials, and Legends, that is sort of the Bible of the early history, he says that Malcolm Macmillan settled about the year 1800 in what was then Montgomery County, pitching his camp near an oak tree on the site of the present town of Vidalia. In the same neighborhood, he built his pioneer home. He also erected a Presbyterian house of worship to the pastorate of which his cousin, Reverend Murphy Macmillan, was called. So that was the first church at Vidalia. He didn't bother to get anybody else to help him. He just built a church and provided the preacher, but something happened. I suppose most of them died out, and the Presbyterian church vanished until later. Another one was built, and let me read something about that from this. This is a copy of a paper that Janie Jenkins wrote. She was the wife of Warren Jenkins, who is credited with founding Vidalia. And I want to read you what she said about Presbyterian Church. She said, the Presbyterians have the honor of erecting the first house of worship. Well, this is the second one she's talking about. She said that the congregation was so small because there were so few people here who were Presbyterians that the building committee, now get this, the committee to build a church was composed of 2 Baptists, 2 Methodists, and 1 Presbyterian. She said that shows you what good fellowship existed in those days. Well, obviously, if they had a church as early as 1800, there were people here long before Vidalia was founded.
Moses M. Coleman, Jr., a native of the area, was a 1951 graduate of Georgia Tech. Working with the nation's space program in the 60s as an electrical engineer, Mose Coleman returned to Vidalia in the late 60s, where he now owns and operates a wholesale distributing business. Mose Coleman was kind enough to share with us some of the information he has gathered while researching the history of Vidalia.
Well, the area we were talking about, I guess, is Montgomery County, Toombs County, and Tattnall County. That area was populated in the early 1800s, and people mostly worked in timber, I think. There were a few sawmills, some grist mills, and some cotton gins, but they didn't have any transportation. The railroads went around this area, and none went through it. And Mount Vernon was the major town in this area. They had been trying for years to get a railroad to come through, and finally in the 1880s, several railroads proposed to run a line through this area. One of them was the Central Railroad and Banking Company. Around 1888, they were about ready to build a railroad from McRae through Mount Vernon to Savannah. Well, the reason the Central Railroad wanted to connect up at McRae was to connect with the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railroad that ran from somewhere up north, but it ran through Eastman, McRae, Lumber City, Hazelhurst, Baxley, down to Brunswick. That was the nearest railroad to this area. And when people wanted to use a railroad, they used Lumber City. That was, I guess, the most accessible. Even though it came through Baxley, I think you couldn't get across the Altamaha River very easily. So the plan was to connect at McRae and run a line to Savannah. And a straight line from McRae to Savannah would have come south of Mount Vernon and just north of the river, Altamaha River. But they didn't want to come that way because there were not very many people living in that area. So they wanted to come north of that, come through Mount Vernon and through this area that where there were people. So that was their plan. But they had a big rally in Mount Vernon. The Central Railroad people came down and made speeches and got everybody excited. And then I think within 2 months, the railroad got sold and they changed their plans. And they thought that was another deal where they, had been promised a railroad and didn't get it. So then Colonel Hawkins over in Americus, he was a railroad man over there, and he was a big competitor of the Central. They'd locked horns before, and so he decided he would build a railroad from Americus to Savannah, since the Central couldn't make up their mind what to do. So he started from that end, and then the Central got excited about it. So they started from Savannah, and they were going to build a railroad. And they both started building, and the two railroads met up at Lyons. Lyons wasn't a town, but they met up there. And the original plan was just keep building. It'd just be two railroads going between McRae and Savannah. But they decided to connect up and just have one railroad, and it would be two railroads that would meet in Lyons. So they did. And that worked okay for a year maybe. And then the Central decided that they were going to cut them off, and so they wouldn't let the Savannah, Marcus, and Montgomery trains go through. So they had to stop at Lyons and change trains. And then they got to where they wouldn't cooperate with the schedule. So passengers going through had to wait 2 or 3 hours in Lyons before they could continue the trip. So it was really a big mess for years. And finally the Savannah, Marcus, and Montgomery went broke. And I think it became the Georgia and Alabama Railroad then. And finally they got where they got the schedules working again. And you could go through. Well, it was customary, I believe, for railroads to name new depots that they created. And I know it was customary for Colonel Hawkins to do it, because he named a whole bunch of towns, and named some after his family members, and some after friends, and some after places he'd visited. And they named them, by the time the trains rolled, I think the towns had names. And I think he picked the name, and that was it. I know Cordele was named for his wife and daughter. They were named Cordelia, and they wanted to name it that, but it was too similar to Cornelia, so they just named it Cordele. And Rochelle, I think, was named for a place in France that he had visited. And Vidalia's the mystery. He named it, but nobody seems to know where he got the name. And I sort of think that he got it from Vidalia, Louisiana. That's the only other town in the world by that name, and I can't imagine where else he could get the name.
Here, I think we find out why Vidalia was named. We don't know where the origin of the name itself. But a few years ago, my daughter Kathy Harrison and I were doing a series of stories on the history of Lyons, and we found that Vicky Tips of Vidalia is the stepdaughter of the man who is the great-grandson of Samuel Hawkins, who put the railroad through here. And through her, we obtained a paper written by Samuel Hawkins' daughter telling how Lyons got its name. Samuel Hawkins was a very prosperous, a very prominent man in Georgia, and when railroads came in, he added that to his many other investments. And in this letter, she tells how they could hardly wait for him to come home to tell them what he had found, because he would start out in just a buggy and a horse and go out into what I say is the sticks, the backwoods. Of course, there were no hotels, there were no places to stay, so he would stop along the way at any house that would take him in, and he found that the people were very hospitable. Since there were no other places to stay, they were always glad to welcome a stranger. But when he got back, the railroad was completed, and he got letters saying that now he would have to name these places. What they had done was just stop along the way and number them, Station 1, Station 2, Station 3, but each of those little places was beginning to grow, and they wanted a post office. As I told you, the people here had to go to Higgston to get their mail, and since they needed names in order to get a post office, he was told to supply them. reason that he was hesitant to do that was he had tried to name one place for his wife Cordelia, but there was already a Cornelia, so the state turned him down, said that'd be too confusing. So then they were going to name it for him, for his family, and there was already a Hawkinsville, so he couldn't do that. Eventually they agreed on Cordelia. Well, he said he had had so much trouble trying to name one town, he didn't want to bother, so he turned it over to his officials thinking they would be pleased to name towns, and all they could see was just woods. They didn't see any prospects there, so they were not interested. So the family got a book. They had just come back from Europe, and they got a book with names in it, and they just started picking names. So a lot of the names along here have European names. This paper was written in response to the request from the people of Rochelle, Georgia, to tell how their name came about. And so the names in it do dwell with those from over there. We have Ryan, Georgia, we have Turin, Georgia, we have Rochelle, and of course Lyons, after Lyon, France. She doesn't tell how Vidalia got its name because she was addressing the foreign names, but it stands to reason that if he was naming them in order, that Vidalia would have been named just before or just after Lyons. Why, we don't know, but we think that's how the name came about.
Before we go any further, I'd like to back up and look at a few documents that will help us in understanding who was in the area prior to Vidalia's founding and why the railroad tracks were laid where they were. As is usually the case in a deal that took place 100 years ago, we may never really know who approached who, nor who may have been the originator of the idea. But records clearly do show that on December the 4th of 1889, an agreement was made between Elizabeth McIntyre, Caroline McIntyre, Freeman and Thomas Thompson, and the Americas Investment Company, where the landowners would donate land to the Americas Investment Company for a depot and additional lands for development. A depot designation was obtained, and on April 3rd of 1890, the area comprising the downtown station and early central business district was swapped between the McIntyres, Thompsons, and the Americas Investment Company. The land involved had rested for many years in the ownership of the estate of Daniel McIntyre, who moved from Robertson County, North Carolina, into the area in 1815. Daniel, with his wife Lucy Curry and eldest son John, made residence in a log cabin located in the vicinity of the present intersection of Jackson Street and Pinecrest Drive. Of interest also is that the same Elizabeth McIntyre, who appears on the deed which gave the land for the depot, also shows up on the deed which gave the land at the corner of 2nd and Church Street for a church and cemetery, with the church being established in 1874. The cemetery which now surrounds the church had been used prior to 1874 for burials. The oldest known grave in the cemetery is that of Alexander McIntosh, who died in 1834. Elizabeth McIntyre was the wife to John McIntyre, son to Daniel McIntyre, who settled in the area in 1815. Now let us go back to Moses M. Coleman, Jr. and discuss with him a few of the names that were in the area prior to 1890 and a few of the communities that existed prior to and just after Vidalia's founding.
Well, in the middle 1800s, I think there were McMillans, McLeods, McIntyres, McIntoshes, McQueens, Wilkes, Thompsons, Collins. Those were some of the names. And some of them were professional men. There were some doctors and lawyers in the area before there was a railroad. Well, there were several communities, and this area was Montgomery County then, and the most eastern part of Montgomery County there was a community called Sterling, and there were about 150 people who lived there, and that was just this side of Lyons. It was about 5 miles east of Vidalia, and there was they had several stores and a sawmill, and a gin, and a blacksmith, and a grist mill that I know of, and a doctor. Stacer actually came along later, I think. I think Stacer came after the railroad, but Stacer was about halfway between Vidalia and Lyons. And it was mainly a sawmill, but they had a post office because they postmarked mail there. It was not a very big community, but they had a store too. Garbutt and Donovan, as I remember, was about a mile east of Stacer. And Garbutt and Donovan had a railroad. It was, in fact, it was called the Garbutt and Donovan Short Line Railroad. And they ran from, they connected up with the seaboard in Lyons and went out. Well, they had some names, I don't know where they came from, but one of them was Alpine, was just west of Lyons, and then went out to Stacer, and then turned north and went up into Emmanuel County and connected up with the Georgia and Florida Railroad up there. And the railroad was mainly for hauling timber out of the woods, but I believe they might have hauled some freight too. They had everything. There was Garbutt and Donovan sawmills, Garbutt and Donovan cotton gins, Garbutt and Donovan stores. They were into everything, really. I probably did. I think the Darbys had sawmills in Florida. Sawmill must have been operating from 1900 up to maybe 1915, somewhere in there, because the kids used to ride the train to school and back.
Now that we have a better understanding of what the area was like before the railroad and its founding in 1890, and of some of the families that lived in the area, let's go back to Kitty Peterson, who discusses a letter written by one of Mr. Warren T. Jenkins's relatives, which details what brought Mr. Jenkins to this area and of his first trip. Mr. Jenkins was one of Vidalia's earliest arrivals, just as the railroad was being built through the area, and one of the major businessmen of the times who is credited with helping Vidalia get established and prosper so quickly. We must keep in mind that when Mr. Jenkins first arrived to look for a new site for his turpentine business, that the land had already been given for the location of the depot and other development by the McIntyres and Thompsons, and that the bedding had been laid for the railroad tracks. This is very likely one of the reasons that Mr. Jenkins chose this area when he arrived, considering the virgin forest in the area and the fact that a railroad track was being laid, making movement of materials and goods possible into and out of the area.
I don't know. I don't know in here just when she wrote this. I don't know why she wrote this letter, but it was sometime possibly after he died. And Mr. Jenkins, somewhere in there I could find out when he died. But here's how he happened to get here. When Warren Jenkins left Robeson County, North Carolina, to come to Georgia looking for a site to locate, it was no surprise that he should wind up in Mount Vernon, Montgomery County, because there were quite a few residents here who had come from North Carolina, some from Robeson County. In Mount Vernon, he contacted Mr. Jim McNett, who put in to help him find a suitable site to locate a turpentine business on. After inspecting several sites, the one he picked was about 10 miles east of Mount Vernon, adjoining the S.A.&M Railroad right-of-way. The roadbed had been graded, but no track had been laid. The site picked turned out to be the intersection of Northwest Railroad Avenue and I can't exactly, I think it's College Street, I'm not sure, because this is, so much of this is obliterated through the years. It has weathered and the ink has faded. After an arrangement had been made locally, such as leases, equipment, and whatever, he returned to North Carolina to gather up a crew of hands, that is, employees. He put the crew of hands onto the train. They came back to Baxley, Georgia, which was the nearest railroad station. Now listen, from Baxley, he and his hands walked to the above site, arriving the last day of January 1890. On February, I quote, I put some bunch to building shanties and another bunch to cutting boxes. And then the first freight train to come along stopped in front of his commissary, but when the conductor asked him if this was Vidalia, he told him he didn't know. The conductor said he had a shipment of goods for W.T. Jenkins Company in Vidalia. So he told the conductor that, well, this was the place. So it's been Vidalia ever since. At that time, mail had to be gotten at Higgston, Georgia, that being the nearest U.S. post office.
The first record that I know of that mentions the name Vidalia was the April 3rd issue of the Montgomery Monitor. And they mentioned that the Americas Investment Company was running the town of Vidalia, whatever that means. Maybe they were surveying the streets, but that was April the 3rd, 1890. And that was, let's see, that was a couple of months before the train started running. So it was named ahead of, before the train came to town. The first physician in Vidalia was Dr. John Meadows, and he was a young graduate of, I believe, the Augusta Medical School. And pretty soon he was followed by George Gray, Ralph Morris, Wilson D. Coursey, and W.F. Peacock. Those were all doctors in the first decade of Vidalia's history. The Vidalia's first newspaper came out in 1894 or before, I'm not sure, but that was the Vidalia Star, and that stayed around a few years. The first hotel was built in 1891. The growth was phenomenal at first. Now, I don't think they were building brick buildings. I think they were just throwing together wooden buildings, but there were lots of stores, blacksmith shops, hotels, you name it. But they were all pretty crude, I think.
As mentioned earlier, Mr. Warren T. Jenkins arrived in this area around January of 1890 to set up a turpentine business. By July of that first year, Mr. Jenkins had applied for and received authority to locate a post office in Vidalia. Before this, Vidalians had to travel to Higgston to receive their mail. Mr. Jenkins located a new post office in a wooden structure, which also housed the Jenkins Meadows druggist. As mentioned earlier, Vidalia's first buildings were mostly built of wood and would be considered crude by our modern-day standards. But this was a new town in its first beginnings, and wood was slowly replaced by brick and concrete as the town continued to grow. These are pictures of Vidalia from the early 1900s. Now that we have reviewed Vidalia's early years up to its founding and the years just after, we'll move ahead and interview three individuals who have interesting stories to share with us. We'll begin by talking with Mr. Milton Brogdon, a resident of Uvalde and ex-president of Brogdon State Bank in Uvalde. Mr. Brogdon is going to take us back to 1916, when he, as a child, and his family made a trip to Vidalia and had their picture taken in front of the Leverett studio.
The picture that I hold in my hand here is the picture of our entire family at that particular time, which I judge was around 1916. And about 1916, the local doctor was Dr. R.H. Mobley, and to go from house to house to his patients, he and my father each bought a car from P.J. McNabb, who was the Ford dealer here in Uvalde at that time. And I've heard my father say a number of times that the total cost, delivered price on this automobile was $432. He kept it for 10 years and decided that he would sell it, and he sold it for $45. And the reason for this picture is, to say my father married Georgia Wallace, who was the daughter of A.B. Wallace in Waynesboro. And we went over, as was conventional in those days, to spend the day with them, my grandparents. And I well remember making the trip, and on the way back, it was kind of a daily thing. On the way back, people in those days carried box lunches, and we stopped on the side of the road and ate our dinner meal, or the middle of the day meal. We came on to Vidalia, and I don't know whose idea it was, and the actual posing or the taking of the picture, I know very little about. But this picture was taken in Vidalia, and with an interview with Ms. Sapp, she told us who that man was on the corner. But I don't recall his name. He seemed like just a man that spent a lot of time on the streets, as people did in those days, just visiting with friends and neighbors. And Ms. Sapp, I believe the Sapps, maybe Ms. Sapp's husband, bought this studio from, bought it from the Leveretts, and they kept it, of course, until just recently, a few years ago. But we've had a lot of comment on this picture, and we've had several enlargements made, and I think it depicts two things: the dress of the day. Derbies, as you noticed my father had on one, was a very popular headpiece at that time. And the one, and I'm the one that's nearest to the camera there, and my brother, who was 2 years older than I, he was on the other side. Another thing it depicts, of course, is the year model of the automobile. This was called, of course, a Ford Roadster, and you can probably detect that the radiator was polished brass, and the top would let back, and it had two brass lanterns on either side of the windshield in front, as you can see there. The tires are very small, and it was rather difficult to get, and there were very few paved roads or hard surface roads at that time, and most of them were sand beds. And as it, over the years, you just kind of get it like a snake. It'd be crooked, and you'd take those small tires, would submerge themselves down into sand, and a lot of times it would just stall right in the middle of the road. And the only salvation for that would be to get some out of the mules and pull it out of the sandy part, or get pine straw or leaves on the side of the road and chug the wheels in.
We now go to Mr. James Glisson, who was born in 1896 between Gray's Landing and Cedar Crossing. Mr. Glisson, being born only 6 years after Vidalia was founded, described to us his early school days at Wax Hill in 1903, and then his memories of crossing the Altamaha River on ferries before there were any bridges.
It was located, you know where Smyrna Church is? Mm-hmm. Well, and where the Currys live, right below Currys is next is Burke's, and you know where Weber's Mill Pond is? Mm-hmm. that was between where Burks lived and Webb's Mill Pond. Every pupil that was in this group walked there. There wasn't any of them that rode anywhere at all in this school. And the one teacher, and his name was Emil Purcell. He taught there in 1903, and he came back again and taught again there in 1909. He was single at the time, in 1903, and he boarded up at Ms. Curry's and walked from there to school. And when he came back in 1909, he walked further than that at school. We had no outside toilets at this school at that time. The girls went under the hill to be excused, and the boys went to the branch. Well, now I have a brother in here that was 8 years older than me, and Ed McNatt and Adam McNatt, I would think was older than he was. Because I believe Percy McNatt was about the age of my brother, P.J. McNatt.
Though Mr. Glisson was not born in Vidalia, Mr. Glisson's keen memory helps us understand what it was like in the area surrounding Vidalia and how remote areas only 10 or 20 miles away were, considering the modes of transportation, the roads, and in early days, the lack of bridges across the larger rivers. The Altamaha was one of these rivers.
Well, now, down there where I live, there was Mann's Ferry. That was there on the McNatt land, right back. That's the closest one there. And then the next one to that up there was Neil's Ferry. I crossed there on the flat. I never did cross on the flat at Mann's Ferry, but I crossed at Neil's Ferry on the flat. And Town Bluff, I never crossed there on the flat. The first time I recall crossing there was in 25, and Mr. Poole was running the ferry there then, but yeah, I crossed on that ferry in a Model T Ford. Now, when I crossed that Neil's Ferry, they had long poles, and they would push themselves up the river. When the river got too high, you couldn't cross when them poles wouldn't reach the ground. But they'd push themselves way up the river, on close to the edge, and then they'd push out, and it would drift, and they knew how far to go to drift to hit right across from where they wanted to land on the other side. And when you came back, well, it's the same way again. They'd push you up on that side and drift and come back. But when Mr. Poole was running that ferry, he had a motor out, I believe they said taken out of an old car, sitting in a boat, and it was fastened side of the flat, and it would pull it back, and there was a cable. And at Bell's Ferry, I crossed there a good bit with a mule and buggy, and there was a cable across, and that cable was fastened to each end of the flat, and the ferryman, he'd catch the cable at one end and walk to the other end, and then he'd keep going back into that, so walking back into on the flat.
After roads and automobiles improved to the point that traveling 20 or 30 miles was feasible for the people living outside the Vidalia area, many, like Mr. Glisson, began to travel to Vidalia to do their shopping and trading.
Well, I went to Lee Hardware, because that's where Mr. Sharp done his trading, and we went there Tommy Q. Van worked with Lee Hardware at that time. That was on Meadow Street. And Sims Grocery, I guess it was groceries. That was on the street facing the railroad. I traded there. I carried a load of peanuts out there, swapped them to Sims for groceries. He gave me 3 cents a pound for peanuts. Carried them with a mule and wagon. It was a Sims store. As far as I know, it was right there next to John Lee Meadows. I remember going to John Lee Meadows. You had a time of getting in there. Most anything you asked for, though, he'd tell you, I got it here somewhere, and he'd keep plundering just about it until he'd find it.
Serving as probate judge since 1945, when she won office after the death of her father, who held the same office since 1917, Mrs. Anna Laurie Hagan Hussey was born on Church Street in Vidalia in 1897. At 93 years of age, Mrs. Hussey could possibly be one of, if not the oldest public servants in the United States. Interviewed by Mr. Bill Worthen, Mrs. Hussey shared with us her memories of the past.
She was early years were spent in Vidalia, and we wanted her to tell us something about how she remembered Vidalia at the turn of the century. Anna Laura, were you born on Church Street in Vidalia?
Yes.
That house used to be, when it was there, used to be we figured it was the oldest house in Vidalia. And it's such a shame that we lost it.
It's one of the oldest, I imagine.
Well, there are many houses around it. Now this house is right diagonally across from the present Methodist Church and across from the old cemetery.
Yes.
And were there any other houses around that when you were
Yes, there was, later on, there was a row of houses down toward town that Mr. Fox built.
Those were
Those were not there,
Uh-huh.
of course. When I was small, there was nothing there between there and town, except right down there at the corner of First Street was one house that Mr. Grace lived in, B.H. Grace.
B.H. Grace, Well, tell us about where you went to school.
I went to school in Vidalia. I first started to school across the railroad over there. I couldn't tell you where it was because even if somebody took me over and pointed it out, I couldn't tell you. It was an old wooden building. And I went to school there in first and second grade. And then the Vidalia Collegiate Institute was built. And I went to school there until we moved to Lyons.
You remember as a girl where you all went for picnics and parties and swimming and that sort of thing?
Well, we didn't swim back in those days. But we would go to right down Church Street, but you couldn't go straight down Church Street, you had to go down Jackson. There was a place there, they called it In the Grove. We'd go there. It was just right now in downtown Vidalia, but it was getting out the edges.
But it was on Church Street.
Church Street.
That became the city campground, and they cleaned it up and developed it. And they used to have in the 20s there would be people coming from the north and would stop and camp there, and would, just as they would be traveling in mobile homes today. Well, after the Vidalia was part of the county, I understand they were trying to get the county seat in Vidalia, even though it was pretty well set in Lyons. And then after they built the courthouse, it burned rather mysteriously, didn't it?
Well, I don't know. You know, back then they had wooden floors in the upstairs, and they were having a trial up there. And I don't know why, but in the boxes where they dumped their ashes, they had sawdust in there. And my father always said that caused the fire, because it started upstairs.
Well, it wasn't necessarily somebody in Vidalia.
No, but when they rebuilt it, they said they poured the floors on the second floor, said Vidalia couldn't burn it.
Well, it burned.
Vidalia didn't have anything to do with burning that courthouse.
When did it burn? What year?
In November of 1917.
The building was just 11 or 12 years old then when it burned.
The clock struck 24 times at 4 o'clock. And that woke up the people on the hill, and they started shooting pistols, and that's the only way they had to get around and wake up everybody. And then, of course, Papa got up and ran right on over here with Mr. McLeod, who was sheriff, And I don't.
Was that Bruce
Yes,
McLeod?
was Bruce McLeod's father,
Father.
George McLeod. And he and Papa went in the clerk's office, and Des had left some books out on the table, and they put those in the vault and closed the vault because they had a lot of money tied up in those books. And my father had pneumonia after that because he climbed in the back window of the vault to see if that door was securely closed to keep the records from burning. And it was, but the vault wouldn't lock, but he was afraid it wasn't closed good.
Well, were any records destroyed?
No, except in the tax collector's office and in the commissioner's office. They had no vaults. The vault in the clerk's office and the probate judge ordinary's office was saved.
Of particular interest are the memories of when she was introduced to dancing, something not accepted at first by all, a fact made quite apparent to her and her dancing conspirators after a dancing session in Lines.
Well, we danced in that old opera house I was telling you about.
But how did you learn? I think you told me
Well,
about the learning.
we had a dancing school, and your father was one of the instigators of it. He was the one who got Miss Annie Wicker to come down here from Sandersville and teach dancing. And the young men in the had the club over there. There was 12 young men that lived there in the Bachelor's Club. I don't know what the name was. And
that's the present Cooper Funeral Home.
yes, and that was the Reagans built that house. Bill Reagan and John.
Reagan. Well, now, what happened to the girls that went to the dancing class?
Well, one girl got turned out of the Baptist church, and your father said I did, but I wasn't a Baptist.
But he was turned out.
Your father and Dr. Coleman, who was a dentist here, the three of them were turned out of the Baptist church for dancing.
Yep.
Well, it was a hot soaking smooth.
During 1910, 20, and 30, Vidalia grew beyond belief. Wooden structures were replaced by brick and concrete, dirt roads by pavement, and new businesses continued to open as each new day arrived. It was men like W.T. Jenkins, businessman and banker, George N. Matthews, merchant and banker, S.R. Schumann, merchant, John Meadows, doctor and businessman, W.O. Donovan, sawmill owner and banker, J.D. Dickerson, educator, and L.L. Foss, inventor, to name just a few who had visions of a modern, prosperous city and dedicated their lives to make these visions a reality. Murkison Funeral Home, Sea Island Cotton Gin, the Vidalia Advance, and Piggly Wiggly Southern were all started from someone's dreams which became a reality which remains intact today, 80 and 90 years later. This was a time of growth. We tracked down and interviewed 6 Vidalians who arrived during the 1920s and 30s, some seeking farm labor, some jobs in the teaching profession, and others with dreams of establishing their own businesses. The 6 individuals arrived and made their dreams a reality, with all 6 still living in Vidalia, having spent from 50 to 65 years in the place they now call home. Tommy Locke arrived in 1925 seeking farm work. 1927 marked the arrival of Tad Sappho, accepting a job as a teacher. 1927 also marked the arrival of another seeking farm labor and eventually working in some of Vidalia's first grocery stores. His name is Sylvester White. H.B. Estroff bought out Joe Hackle in 1929 and established Estroff's department store. J.L. Tullison moved to Vidalia in 1934 to continue his wholesale grocery business, and in 1938 marked the arrival of H.S. Vandiver, who bought out W.A. Holton, establishing his own variety department store. Tommy Locke was born in Lawrence County in 1895, moving to Vidalia in 1925 after being stationed in France in 1918 during World War II. Originally working on several farms, including the Donovan and the Garbett farms during the 1920s and 30s, he purchased his own farm where at 95 years of age he still lives. We discussed with Mr. Locke what he remembers of France during World War I and then of his memory of seeing his first automobile.
In 1918, come out in 1919.
Stayed 1 year.
Stayed about 14 months. Went in June and come out in August the next year. Well, in other words, we went to France. That's where I spent my time over in France. I didn't get far as Germany. In other words, I was in a labor battalion. I wasn't in the engineer department. So big as we did, unload car boxes and cut wood and so forth, did labor. They just grabbed us up and sent us over there, some of us. Didn't have time to do much training. About 12 days going across. 13 days coming back. Didn't have any airplanes worse then. See an airplane, you'd be surprised to see it. Went across there, we were thinking we were going to probably go to some barracks or another, some house, shelter. Carried us right out in the open field. Right out in the open field. Had some kind of little thing they call pup tents. You had a half a side and I had a half, and we put them together. Stop them down on the ground, and that's where we had to sleep at. Grown men walking around crying on the kind of condition they met when they got over there. Sleep on the ground a lot of time. I rolled up my little, to give you a little, bag of some kind, you put it, trash it, some kind of straw or something in it, and tie it together, and just a little mattress like, and put it on the ground, and then you get on there and sleep. I've rolled up my mattress a good many times. Earthworms be between it and the mattress. I don't see how we live, but we live.
Mr. Locke told us of the first automobile he remembers seeing, and then of the first automobile he ever purchased after moving to Vidalia in 1925.
Well, I remember the first one seen. That was in Lawrence County. That's where I was going. We were sitting on the porch out in the country at my daddy's house. And saw light coming and heard the noise. And we was a little distant from the road. And we just wonder about that light, and we done heard about cars. And it's just a mystery for us to look at that car and hear it running and the light going without a horse pulling it. So then it wasn't long before we was able to see one. Little Model T. It was running, no, they'd make a lot of noise. And we boys run out there and watched that car just as far as we could see it. We were looking at it, amazed at it. So that's where it was back there. I remember when there wasn't no cars at all. See, the first car I bought was, let's see, it was a 28. Because I bought one, it was about a year, 2 years old, something like that.
Good question.
Yeah, I paid $300 for it, cash.
One person who needs no introduction to Vidalians is Tad Saffold, who arrived in Vidalia in 1927 after accepting a job as a teacher. Teaching up into the 70s before total retirement, Mrs. Saffold has been witness to Vidalia's growth for 63 years.
I came to Vidalia in September of 1927, straight out of school, and I was contacted by a niece of the man who was superintendent here, and she in turn recommended me to Mr. Downs, her nephew is who he was, the school superintendent. And I've just been in Vidalia ever since. I said I came here more or less what I certainly think of now as being almost a kid, 20 years old, and I came as a junior high math teacher. I think it was 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, or 7th, 8th, and 9th grade math. I've forgotten just how they had it divided then. Came here for $75 a month. And of course, they sure didn't pay you in the summer or anything like this. You just got strictly that. Times got so bad that there were 4 of us, that young sprouts that were here as new teachers, and we stayed the first year. We had a room at what is now the Altama Gallery. And we had to walk from there to the school, and you know where the school grounds are. There's no building on it now, it's just a vacant lot between here and town. And we'd stop at Patrick's little cafe, which was about, well, the whole cafe wasn't much bigger than this room. But we'd stop there and have our breakfast and then walk on up the hill and across under the railroad track and up to school, see. Patrick's was wedged, well, of course it wasn't wedged in then, but it was in there between where Mr. Book is and where old Belks, between there and the corner. And it was wedged in, there was a furniture store, and it was called, when I first came to Vidalia, it was called Gunter's Furniture Store. Then it changed hands, and I've forgotten who the people were. Can't think right now who it was. Well, the wife is still here, but she's fixing to move, I understand. Drury was the name of the furniture company. And it looked almost like, a lot of people said they thought that it was a sort of a little streetcar, that's how big it was, the Patrick's Cafe. But man, they had a cook back there whose name was Tom Coe, C-O-E, and he was excellent. Everybody in Vidalia at that time, which was about 3,200 people, everybody knew Tom Coe and his pies and the way he fixed eggs for breakfast. Everybody knew Tom. I don't know how in the world, sometimes I think, well, I wonder how in the world they can cook in that little space back there and have this much space left up front up here for us to have tables to sit, you know.
Sylvester White was born in 1918 near Oak Park, Georgia, moving to Vidalia in 1927. Picking cotton as a young youth, Mr. White later started working at the A&P and then Sims grocery stores, delivering groceries on his bicycle.
And that's how we made a living, because we younger fellas, whatever little work we could do, rake a yard or something, cotton picking time, pick cotton, and that's how we made a living. Well, my first was picking cotton as first as I can remember. Well, I picked cotton ever since I was big enough to carry a sack in my sack. Imagine in Oak Park, 6, 7 years old. I used to go to the field with my grandmother and pick cotton and whatever else we could do on the farm, whatever else to be done. Pull corn if necessary, but just right behind her, whatever she did, I had to do some of that too. But my first public job now, what I think was delivering groceries, about the only thing I remember when I first moved over here, because that's how the grocery store used to deliver groceries on a bicycle. Well, I first started working with the, at that time it was the A&P store, right where, right next to where Mr. Wade's Finance is, because that was, Mr. Wade's Finance used to be Mr. D.C. Harris's clothing store, and next to that was the A&P store, and that's where I first started delivering groceries. Well, at that time, people would come in and buy groceries because the clerk had to weigh it up, a dime worth of rice and a quarter worth of this and 15 cents worth of that. That's the way they bought groceries, and he had to pick up every item that they bought and sack it up. That there wasn't in sacks of cans, and by the time he'd sack it all up, it'd be too much for the person to carry it, and we would deliver it on that bicycle, take it wherever, what address he wanted to, and if there was any balance to be paid on it, when we got there, they'd pay us, and we would bring the money back to the store. And from that to the Sims store, well, it was the, it finally turned out to be Piggly Wiggly, but it was Sims store first, which was around on the front street. Well, down the street next to where Bryce's Bank used to be, right on the corner, that was a Sims store right there, and delivered groceries right there. On through my high school days, from say probably 32 right on through, well, other than that, because I was about 30 till I finished high school, right on through until then, delivering groceries. Every chance I got, when I don't go to school and going up in the afternoon to deliver groceries, and all day Saturday, and every little chance we get, but because that's the only way we had to make a quarter to, a couple of dollars a week, is about as much as we got.
When the United States entered World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Mr. White, like many other Vidalians, was inducted into the Army. At first serving as an MP, Mr. White was later transferred to Cheyenne, Wyoming for training before being shipped to Europe 10 days after D-Day.
Call that D-Day. And 10 days after D-Day, we boarded the ship going to France. And of course, when we got to France, the army wasn't but about 15, 20 miles inshore. And when we landed that night, the German planes were still zooming over the beach, and we had to kind of slip in that morning and get off boat in some little LST, they call it troop landing ship, LST. And from there to the land, and we dug in holes there and listened to the big gun, the planes fly over us at night. And of course, then at that time, I was a young fellow, didn't see no excitement, no danger in it, because I was free, single, didn't worry about no danger being in it. I'd lay there and watch the planes zoom at night. Of course, when they get out over the channel, they would shoot them down, but they couldn't shoot them down back there on land because they had a lot of men and ammunition stored back there. But once they get out over the channel, they would burn him down. And I moved in, well, by that time I got into a quartermaster outfit. And they broke up the police outfit. And I got into a quartermaster outfit. They made me a platoon sergeant then. And I just kind of had it made from then on. As a soldier, we moved from there right on up. As the front line moved up, began to handle ammunition, quartermaster outfit. And we were right behind the front lines. And every time the front line moved up,
H.B. Estroff moved to Vidalia in 1929 when he bought out Joe Hackle and established Estroff's department store. 61 years later, Mr. Estroff is retired, but the store remains in the Estroff family under the direction of his son and grandson.
I had known about Vidalia for many years. I had a brother, Bill Estroff, in Lyons, Georgia, and I visited him every summer. Vidalia being a much larger city, it was not unusual for the Lyons people to come up here to eat, go to the picture show. There was none in Lyons, and they had one here that changed reels. And that is one of the pleasures that they had. There was a Hackle Brothers department store here who had been here for many years, who had an excellent reputation for being a good store with above the lower price level of merchandise. Joe Hackle wanted to move his family to Jacksonville, Florida, because he had a brother-in-law in business, in the movie theater business, who had a chain of theaters which cost 10 to 15 cents a ticket, and he wanted to expand. He went to Florida, he and Miss Hackle and his 5 daughters, and they built several theaters. The highest price one, I believe, was 25 cents, and it was very, very successful. When Hackle decided to move from Vidalia, my brother knew about it. I was living in Louisville, Georgia at the time. I had graduated from the University of Georgia in accounting, but decided that I would rather be a merchant because I did not have the patience to sit down all day long and work on accounting, even though I loved it. I came to Vidalia and looked over the store, and within the course of several weeks, I traded with Joe Hackle on June the 5th, 1929. Joe Hackle had 3 stores connected there. In order to be more conservative, I closed up 2 stores on the west side and operated a corner store, which is occupied by Mike Smith. The other merchants in town at that time was D.C. Harris, there was Rushing and Page, and later Page went into business himself in the building next to the drugstore Dean's Pharmacy, which was on the corner where Phillips Pharmacy is now. In addition to that, there were several other retail stores here. As for the grocery stores, there was very few. There was an A&P store here at one time. Baron Godby had a store. Baron Godby Sr. had a store at one time. Oberworthing had a store at one time. And Mrs. Thompson, Ms. Lewis Thompson, I believe it was, had a grocery store. There was only one hamburger joint here. That was run by Johnny Wiggins. The cost of a hamburger at that time was either 10 or 15 cents. I don't recall what the potatoes were, but I'm sure they were reasonable enough. That was in a tin building back of the old. Coming back to recall some of the interesting things in Vidalia. Of course, all of us of my age remember the Depression, the Big Depression. If they were not there at the time, I'm sure they heard many stories about it. I recall my brother Bill walking in the store one day and saying to me, I saw something that I thought I would never see in all my life. I saw cotton sell for a nickel a pound. That was $25 a bale. That was, of course, below the cost of production and hard living to produce it. Of course, there were many sharecroppers, too, who suffered for the bare necessities of life, just enough. Labor cost was not high. I paid the best sales lady I had $15 a week, and she worked from 8 o'clock until the time we closed. And we stayed open as long as somebody on the street. On Saturday nights, we'd stay open till 12 o'clock. And after we closed, I would always go to Pope's barber shop and get a haircut or a shave or a shower. At that time, that's what everybody did. Went to the barber shop to take a shower. As I recall, some of the prices there, we sold overalls for 89 cents. Men's dress shirts advertised for 98 cents. Men's, summer fabrics, 25 cents a yard. Hanes underwear and shorts, 19 cents a piece. Wash frocks, dresses, $1.49. Bedspreads, $1.29. It was just inconceivable that anybody could stay in business at those prices. Of course, they were certainly not inflated. They were very much deflated.
J.L. Tollison moved his wholesale grocery business from Baxley to Vidalia in 1934. Serving as mayor of Vidalia in 1950 and 51, Mr. Tollison has witnessed the growth of Vidalia over the last 56 years.
That building was 5 years old. People had built it in Depression. They had gone under, and the building was vacant. And I knew Mr. Oliver, who was salesman with them and had some stock in the company that went broke, and I hired him to come and work travel for me in Baxley. And he immediately tried to sell me on moving to Vidalia, and I came and looked it over and decided it was the move. So Lee and Oliver was responsible for my being in Vidalia. Of course, when I came here, where S-Trough is now, well, I believe that the corner building there was a two-story with the telephone company on the south end of it, facing Jackson Street, Church Street. And then next to it was where S-Trough, he owned all that now, I believe. But let's see, Leader and Rosansky, they were in business there, but they were getting older, and well, one of them was here living then. And it was then Mr. S-Trough, who was one of the finest gentlemen Vidalia ever knew. He was across the street where Mac Smith just went out of business. The Mac Smith family went out of business. He was located there when I came to Vidalia, and then after he bought the Leader Rosansky property and built there, and then bought some more property and kept only had where the S-Trough store is now. All that up there almost to the Miami Cafe, where Miami Cafe was. I believe Wolf Music coming in and say, all that been built up to that building, I believe, since I came to Vidalia. And Max, so she was happy to stay home, and we liked Mac Gray all right, and went to Paxland. Lived there 10 years, but Vidalia is different from all of them. It's people in Vidalia work. People here with the most money are the hardest workers. Mr. Bryce, up until he died, was, and I presume, I imagine he was the most wealthy man in Vidalia at that time. And I suspect he was one of the hardest workers in Vidalia. If you notice, most of the people here work. Vidalia's been right fortunate to have pretty good business people here. I'm not talking about me, but I'm talking about Vidalia has.
As stated by J.L. Tollison, Vidalia has been fortunate in a number of quality businessmen who established businesses in the area, making Vidalia their home. One of these men is H.S. Vandiver, who moved to Vidalia in 1938 to establish a variety department store. In 1949, he accepted the position of Executive Vice President of the Vidalia Chamber of Commerce, dedicating 28 years to the Chamber and to the growth of Vidalia.
I was born in 1907, and being a Southerner, I liked the South and wanted to come back, but my early training and my young life was with the Deputy Grant Company. I served as manager up there for 8 years and resigned as a manager to come back south and bought out 2 variety stores here from Mr. W. A. Holton. And when I came here in 1938, the population in 1940, according to the census, was 4,109 people. From that, we have grown to approximately around 13,000, which they expect the census to be in 1990, and we have made a tremendous growth since then. I came to Vidalia because of the fact I had a brother who was in the variety store in Fitzgerald, Georgia, and he knew of these 2 stores, and he knew that they were for sale and was available. And so he was the fellow who did the negotiating for me before I resigned from the company. That's how I came to Vidalia. After coming to Vidalia, it was we were still need industries, and so people became interested in trying to get weekly payrolls. And as a result of that is really what brought on everybody becoming interested in it, is really what brought on the industrial development in Vidalia. However, though, go back to World War II, we had scrap drives back in those days to get all the scrap metal we could find anywhere. The farmers put it out on the side of the road, and a certain day we came along with the help of the U.S. Army and picked up the scrap metal, whatever you could find it, all along the country roads. And they had a huge pile of it over in Vidalia, where is now the current, or the former, Belt Matthews stores was. And if Mayor would like to show you just some idea what the picture was all about, and this is a picture of the part of the scrap metal that you saw back in those days. It was a tremendous success, and everybody wanted to contribute as much as they could, and it had a tremendous effect, I think, on the people in this area in trying to do our part with World War II. In 1948, I resigned I sold my stores. And then in 1949, I reluctantly accepted the position of the Executive Vice President of the Vidalia Chamber of Commerce. And from that day forward, really back in 1945, I shouldn't go back, when we got the first interest, which was the Vidalia Garment Company, now better known as the Oxford Industries. A group of the local people here became interested in, I said, those weekly payrolls, and we were able to locate the Vidalia Garment Company, and from that day forward we moved to get other industries in the area. After that, then of course it wasn't long before we brought in the Globe Manufacturing Company and also the Palmetto Box Manufacturing Company. A little further down the line we were able to get the Hazelhurst Manufacturing Company, a tool and die industry, and Chickasha Mobile Homes and other industries that we went down the road. We finally wound up, though, I think, with the chamber. I think the last industry that came in while I was the executive vice president was the Federal Pacific Electric Company, which is located between Vidalia and Lyons. And with all of these industries, though, we had to work and had to work hard. The Federal Pacific Company had locations in North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, and they had 3 sites selected in each of the states. And finally, Vidalia was able to win out over all the other cities and all the other states. And that too has been some of the other work I think that was interesting, particularly for those people back in the 40s, where the Kiwanis Club had a screening for their lungs, I believe it was, and this picture shows a complete lineup of the Kiwanis members and how they supported the drive and so forth. We also supported the tobacco market, particularly through the Kiwanis Club, because that was the Chamber of Commerce before we had a Chamber of Commerce. And we got behind the merchants, and the merchants and everybody else got behind the tobacco market. And along in 1946, we almost lost a set of buyers. So in order to try to stimulate more of the farmers selling their tobacco in Vidalia, the Kiwanis Club supported the idea of purchasing a thoroughbred bull, and Mr. F.D. Gerard and myself were the one who went over to Edenton, Georgia, I believe, and purchased the bull. And this was the first time that I can recall that we ever had any kind of a prize given like this, bringing people into Vidalia. As a result of it, we had a tremendous year, and Vidalia came back from nowhere to almost, I believe they also sold more tobacco in that year than they had than anyone in the southern belt, so to speak. And this picture also here shows the crowd gathering over on Jackson Street, which is just this side of the post office. And it shows a big crowd who had assembled to see who was going to win the prize bull at that particular time. Also, the only thing I can think of at the moment is the fact, I go back to the fact I believe that Vidalia is an up-and-coming city. It's you think of the distance between Vidalia, Augusta, and Savannah. It is a natural to be developed into a retail trade center, plus the fact that we have the industries here now. And the general idea was, back when the chamber first got started, that once they got the momentum going in the right direction, that the momentum within itself would keep the ball rolling economically, so to speak, and that it would continue to grow. And really, that is what has happened. That's exactly what has happened.
Before we leave the 20s and 30s, we need to look at three other important dates. The first date of 1926 marked the year that R.E. Ledford moved to Vidalia and bought the Vidalia Advance newspaper, which was established in the early 1900s. 1931 is our second date of importance. This was when Moses M. Coleman began commercially growing and shipping the Vidalia onion. Our third date of 1937 marked the completion of Dickerson Training Center by the WPA. The late R.E. Ledford moved to Vidalia in February of 1926, purchasing the Vidalia Advance newspaper, which at the time was being operated by the Vidalia Kiwanis Club. We talked with Bill Ledford, editor of the Advance, about the paper and its beginnings.
Father and mother came here in 1926. At the time the newspaper was being operated by the Vidalia Kiwanis Club. Vidalia didn't have a Chamber of Commerce then, except in the form of the Vidalia Kiwanis Club, and they felt like that Vidalia very definitely, like any other town, needed a newspaper. So they had hired Mr. Sawyer, A.F. Sawyer, to run the newspaper. And my father came here in February, in fact, in February of 1926, and bought the newspaper, coming here from, oddly enough, from the Cherokee Advance in Canton, Georgia. We, of course, had some rough times in those first days. I think my father said he had 20 cents in his pocket when he got to Vidalia. Times were rough, but he worked hard, had the cooperation of a lot of people in the community that felt like Vidalia needed a strong weekly newspaper. I remember the hot type days, those terrible times when cranky linotypes almost ran us crazy. And then how the Advance has been able to keep up with the technology of the industry, and today is operated with fancy electronics and computers and laser printers and that sort of thing. We have a very sophisticated perfecting plant at the Development Authority area in Soapton, a business called Unipress. And it prints this newspaper, our Advantage, and the Lion's Progress, as well as 17 other weekly newspapers in the area, and a number of shoppers. We feel a great affinity for this community. We're grateful to this community. We could not have been as successful had it not been for a growing, prosperous, caring community like we live in. I remember reading some notes that my father had written concerning the newspaper. Apparently he did it for a speech he was making somewhere. And I found those notes, and I remember that in those notes he said that the Advance was not just a newspaper to serve his interest, but it was a newspaper to serve the interest of the community. And in so...
The growing and national marketing of the Vidalia onion has made the name Vidalia known throughout this country, some claiming the world. With such an important event, we always attempt to seek out the person responsible. But with the Vidalia onion, that search is not so easy, for history shows us many people over a span of some 50 years made the Vidalia onion what it is today. Records indicate the Bermuda onion was being grown experimentally in small lots back in the early and mid-20s. But it was Moses M. Coleman, an aggressive young businessman and farmer, who looked at the onion as an item that had marketing potential beyond the local market. By 1931, Moses Coleman had begun loading his onions into trucks, driving to the big produce market in Columbia, South Carolina, and as far away as Philadelphia. This photo, possibly the oldest known to exist, shows one of Coleman's workers atop a load of onions during one of Coleman's many trips to out-of-state markets. It is doubtful any amount of research will ever be able to explain what followed, but over the years more and more people picked up on the idea of marketing the onions outside of the area. This 16mm movie shows Phil Freeze directing the planting of onion plants around 1940. Mr. Freeze was managing Tanner Bryce Company for a group of investors who had just purchased controlling interest in the company. Unfortunately, Freeze's dream of promoting the onions out of state on a large scale, having made commitments to A&P, Kroger, Safeway, and others located in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, became a nightmare when the crop was caught by rains, causing rot to set in before they could be sold. It was the total efforts of the farmers, promoters, and businessmen who refused to give up on the onion through the hard times and good, failures and successes that eventually led to the success of the onion. An onion grown in a small remote area of the southeastern United States had become nationally famous and known as the Vidalia onion. James D. Dickerson arrived in 1904 with a dream of establishing a school for Vidalia's blacks. Single-handed at first, J.D. Dickerson, as so many other famous Vidalians, made his dream a reality when he opened a school in an old dilapidated building on McIntosh Street with 24 students, and he is the only teacher. Professor Dickerson quickly gained the respect of all, and by 1907 raised enough funds to erect a two-story frame building on an acre of land on 3rd Avenue. With the completion of the modern brick building in 1937 by the WPA, Professor Dickerson's dreams had surely become a reality, possibly beyond even his imagination. We talked with several residents who fondly remember Professor Dickerson. Inez Coe, born on March the 19th of 1900, remembers her school days as a young girl under Professor Dickerson.
First school, I remember going to Professor Dickerson, but I could memorize good, so they said, I don't know. But I remember they used to have what you call big plays, they called big dialogue, is that right? Dialogue play. Yes. And they would always put me president up. But I know Miss Swinton was the teacher. Miss Swinton, after she found out I didn't know even how the A from B, she wanted to run adult school. And she did. She opened up one, and I went. Well, all he did was, he was kind of a principal. I was too little a grade for him. We had other people too.
Ruth Gamble, born in 1901, shared with us her memories of the Dickerson school days.
And right there is where Professor Dickerson, when I first remember them, they were living next door to us. Professor Dickerson and Ms. Dickerson. In Hickston, that's where they were living. And he was walking down here every day teaching school, and she was teaching at Hickston. And he was walking every day. Well, that had to be about 1906, I reckon, something like that. Well, it had to be, oh, they bought that little home down there in 1906. It had to be 1906 or 7, somewhere along there.
You know?
I don't remember what year it was, but I know he moved to Vidalia. Well, now, the first Dickerson school I remember was that little old frame two-story building down there on, not far from the Methodist church, right down in there now. My children started the school there, some of them. Well, as far as I can remember, it was but 2 rooms. That's all I remember was 2 rooms. And I was the first, when they organized PTA, I was the first secretary they had in that school.
Camellia Peacock, born in Vidalia, remembers going to school at the 2-story wooden building built by Professor Dickerson in 1907.
Well, I went to Dickerson Training School here in Vidalia. We had a 2-story building down here. And it had 2 floors. It was 1 floor downstairs, and then it was a floor upstairs. And we had some water fountains in the back. It was a hole in the back. That's where we get our water. But at that time, we had outdoor closets. It was outdoors. We had to go outside to the closet, and which we kept it very nice and clean. And we had a coal bin. The building was built on high bricks or columns or something, high one. that two-story building was sitting up on them high bricks or column, whatever you would call them. But it was, and so we could, I remember we were burning coal at that time. And we had a coal bin under there where the people would bring coal. And that's the way we kept heat, was by the coal. We had those old pot-belly stoves, you know. And we thought it was fantastic. It was great. And we had one of the best principals that ever been born. There's not one been born and will be born like he was. Because we really did. That's the only place that I didn't go no further than the half of the 8th grade. I was going into the 9th. Then I decided I'd run away and get married, which I regretted it later. But it was too late. And I got my learning from him. He was a principal and a teacher, because I do remember when I got in high school, 8th grade, I remember he had one of our classes. I think it was a geography class. Because we used to have to go, you know, we'd go from room to room for classes. It wasn't exactly like it is now, you know. It was a little difficult, you know. And so I remember he taught one of the classes that I was in. I think it was geography. That was in the 20s. Because I know my mother died in 29, and then the Depression hit. Well, of course, Depression hit in 29, you know, come in 29. And my father, he tagged along with us. He was a great man. Hadn't been for him, I don't know what we would have did. And it was very rough, but we made it through.
Monty Mae White was a graduate of Dickerson Training School in 1947. The last graduating class under the leadership of Professor Dickerson.
The first school that I went to was down by the church. We call it the old school. Now, I didn't go to this other school they're talking about. I don't even know the name, whatever they, Toombs kind of training school. When we stayed here about 4 years. Then we moved to Collin, Georgia for about 3 years. When my stepdaddy died, we moved back to Vidalia. And that's when I went into Dickerson Training School. They had built this brick building then. That's how come I missed the old school. And I went into the 7th grade. Now, when I got to the 7th grade, we had Miss Dickerson. His wife was teaching 7th grade. That was the hardest grade. The year of 1947, June the 2nd. And then in the same year, June the 21st, I got married. During that time was very hard. I didn't have any money to go to college. So I got married, started a family. But now while I was in school, let me say, I think it was about the 8th grade. I was one of Professor Dixon's choice students. When Miss Ray would go out of town to meetings, I would hold her classes, and I would make me $1.25 per a day, which was $6.25, I think, per a week. And to me, that was a lot.
1940 marked Vidalia's 50th anniversary celebration, followed soon afterwards with our nation going to war. It was the beginning of World War II. The 50s followed with signs of growth for Vidalia, which began attracting new industry, namely manufacturing, which employed hundreds of Vidalians. The 50s also rolled in the new era of rolled-up jeans and T-shirts, bobby socks, poodle skirts, crinolines, ponytails, and the likes of Elvis Presley. The early 40s marked a continuation of the carnival-like atmosphere that had begun in the 30s during the tobacco season in Vidalia. Those that lived in the area remember all too well how downtown would fill with automobiles and people so thick that finding a parking space could turn out to be an all-day affair. It was a time that merchants all over town held drawings and promotions and displayed their best goods. Hamburger and hot dog stands would open, sidewalk artists set up their easels, and barefooted boys would run through the crowd screaming, "Peanuts! Fresh boiled peanuts!" It was a time that farmers streamed into town from all the surrounding areas to sell their crop, spending their profits in town for supplies some had waited months or even a year to purchase. Those days are gone now, but not because tobacco is gone, but simply because times have changed. Most claim we grow as much tobacco now as then, but that what hundreds used to grow is now grown by a few. 1 and 2 acre plots have grown into 100-acre plots, planted and harvested by one farmer using new technology and machinery. Austin Morris and his 2 sons are an example of farming in the 1990s, using the experience gained by Austin during his many years of farming and the new technology brought home after 4 years of college by the 2 younger Morrises. Working as a team, the 3 grow hundreds of acres of tobacco each season, bringing it to market in Vidalia just as 50 years ago. Of course, all the fanfare is gone now, lost in the past, except for the memories of those who were there.
You go to the tobacco sale in Vidalia, and if it wasn't for the few cars parked around, you'd never know there was any activity going on around. There's just the tobacco allotments and the production is in the hands of a few now, instead of being so many people. I know in Montgomery County, I expect there used to be 600 or 700 allotments on farms in Montgomery County, and each individual farm grew the tobacco allotment. Sometimes there was 2 or 3 farmers growing tobacco on that one farm. But now I don't think we have but more than maybe 10 or 12, 15 at the most farmers in this county now. And Toombs County is pretty much the same way. You have some farmers in Toombs County that grows above 200 acres of tobacco now instead of 2.5 acres like it used to be years and years ago. Well, when, when I was 10 or 12 years old, we'd go to Vidalia to the tobacco markets. Every warehouse, they must have been 6 or 7 big warehouses out there. Some of them are torn down and gone now, but every one of them had a hot dog stand, and you could smell that hamburger and the scent of hamburgers and hot dogs and onions cooking up down the streets, and they were just, the warehouses was full. There was a lot of people there. It was just an all-day affair.
During a visit to one of the local tobacco warehouses, we ran into Bill Worthen, someone who has dealt with tobacco since a young boy and to this day looks forward to being a part of the tobacco sales each new season. Bill Worthen talked with us briefly about the harvest and sale of this special crop.
Tobacco planted last week, March, first week in April, and the farmers that are growing it give it tender loving care for 3 months. Start harvesting about the 15th of June, and we'll be through probably by the last week in August. After they cure the tobacco, they bring it here in these sheets weighing 150 to 200 pounds, some of them 250. They're placed on the floor, and usually it's 4 to 5 days. It can be as much as 2 weeks before the tobacco will sell. It's put in rows. Then on the day of the sale, you have the graders, who are stabilization graders. This is the cooperative that handles the surplus tobacco. They go through the warehouse, put a grade on each sheet of tobacco. There's some, must be 150 grades. So they have to be experienced and well-trained, and that price is what the cooperative guarantees the farmer will get for that tobacco. After the stabilization graders put the price on it, then the buyers and the auctioneer, the warehouseman come through. The one side of the line is the company or the warehouse people, the auctioneer, the owner who sets the price and encourages the buyers and hoops it up. The other set on the other side are the buyers. They're representing foreign companies, all the American companies. They have certain grades that they want to buy, certain types of tobacco.
if you have 2 and 3 that want the same type, then you have a tremendous increase in price, and it gets exciting. They handle it very quickly and very accurately. They don't do this until they've had 5 and 6 years experience working with a tobacco company, or even longer in many cases. The tobacco will be, after it's bought, price is put on it. Farmer will be paid in 20 minutes after it's sold, an hour. This tobacco will be sheeted up, sorted as to grades, and then loaded on trailers, trucks. It used to be railroads. Something I would like to say is that the tobacco industry was promoted principally by the G&F Railroad. This was a tremendous contribution they made to South Georgia, because they worked very hard to promote it, because, of course, they were the sole haulers of tobacco for 30 or 40 years, until after it became less expensive and much quicker to move by truck. But this tobacco will be in the Carolinas, and will be processed within 3 days to maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks, and be put in storage. The buyers will move from here to South Carolina or North Carolina in the middle of September, and will buy there for 3 or 4 weeks. They'll move on to another area of North Carolina and South Virginia, buy there until the Thanksgiving, 30th of November. Then they go to Kentucky and they start buying burley tobacco, which is entirely different tobacco.
Piggly Wiggly Southern is another Vidalia success story. Founded in 1919 by M.F. Bryce, H.A. Threcold, E.L. Davis, J.W. Dale, and E.L. Tanner as the Tanner Bryce Company, dealing in wholesale and retail grocery, dry goods, and general merchandise. The Depression hit Georgia and Tanner Bryce with a vengeance, and with other businesses to look over, such as his movie theaters and gasoline retailing operations, Bryce sold Tanner Bryce Company to a group of investors, conducting his last directors meeting as president on July 15th of 41. We will pick up with the arrival of G.H. Achenbach, a young investment counselor on Wall Street. Mr. Achenbach was sent to Vidalia to assess the severity of damage and then to return with his recommendations. But as fate would have it, G.H. Achenbach stayed on in Vidalia, where he raised his family in a business that today employs hundreds of Vidalians, distributing goods to 89 company-owned grocery stores. Mr. Achenbach tells us of when he first arrived in Vidalia in 1942 and stayed at the Dixie Hotel.
Oh, well, it was quite an interesting thing, because, to be perfectly honest, when I was on Wall Street, I was living at the clubhouse of a golf club in the summertime, and a friend of mine and myself would go in and rent apartments in New York from people going south, and we'd store our cars in New Jersey and live in there. So I had a pretty fair style of living, and was a bachelor too. Well, when I came here, I had a derby hat and a Chesterfield coat, you know, and these black velvet collars on it and so on, and I wore a Homburg when I didn't wear the derby. Well, I gave the derby and the Chesterfield to the yard man the first week, because I realized it was not the kind of attire that was worn around here. But Miss Annie took me in. And she ran it, little gal, about 5'1" or 2", probably didn't weigh 90 pounds, had a haircut just about as short as mine, but she was a fighting type, well, more than fight, she was like a bantam rooster. You better not pick on her, and she ran that thing like a military camp. But she protected me as a damn Yankee, and wouldn't let anybody say anything bad about me. She just did more nice things, but it was pretty primitive living. In the summertime, it would be so hot. I had a corner room. In fact, I shared the bathroom with Bobby and Jean Tollison. Well, I'd see when they weren't going to use it, and I'd draw a cold tub and put a towel on my bed, and I'd lie in that tub until my teeth were chattering and I was shivering. I'd run, jump in the bed and try to get to sleep before I got hot again. And then in the winter.
24 years with Piggly Wiggly, Dent Temples now serves as Senior Vice President of Distribution and Real Estate and represents the management of the 1990s. Temples discussed with us the new direction under the Bruno family, who purchased controlling interest in 1987.
At the current time, the company is very healthy and doing well, and is owned by the Bruno's Corporation and has the most aggressive growth plans that the company has ever seen. Possibly adding as much as 10 to 15 new stores to its current store base of 89 stores. The current employment is about 550 in the office, warehouse, and drivers, and is expected to grow in the next few years. Currently, we operate, Piggly Wiggly Southern operates in Georgia and one store in South Carolina. However, plans right now on the drawing board for additional stores in South Carolina and also moving into North Florida as we continue to grow. That has been one of the nice things about the merger with the Bruno's organization, is they're very aggressive, very well managed company that's still run from a family base. But they provide opportunity for employees and have a tremendous growth and profitability record.
As we come to a close, we would like to mention 3 athletes who have had a tremendous impact on Vidalia. These are athletes whose names are nationally known and associated with Vidalia. Wally Moses was voted the American League's Rookie of the Year in 1935 while with the Philadelphia Athletics. In his first 7 years in the Major League, he never batted below .300. Moses' name appeared weekly in newspapers all over the country during the 30s, referring to him as the young Georgia recruit, the Vidalia boy, and the Vidalia vandal. Moses stayed with baseball as a batting coach after his playing days and is claimed to have been one of the greatest batting coaches who ever lived. Moses moved back to Vidalia in September of 1989 to be near family members before passing away in October of 1990. We interviewed Moses a couple months before his death, where he discussed meeting Ty Cobb, who pointed Moses towards the major leagues.
Louisville got a team together, Louisville, Georgia. And a guy named Red Willie did own a Texaco station. Did real good business. This is when everybody used US-1, you know. So we played, they put us up, placed the board, and we didn't get, we just got the gate receipts. We didn't make it, we weren't making any money. So Red Willie's brother hunted birds with Ty Cobb. He had some good bird dogs, and Cobb, and he knew all the farmers around there, you know, and Cobb would come down and they'd hunt birds together, and they were friends. So Red asked his brother, said, will you get Ty to come down and umpire the 4th of July doubleheader and draw some people in and make these kids a little money? They ain't made it here all summer. So Cobb agreed to come, and I had a real good day. So Red Willie, after the game, he said, Ty wants to talk to you. So I went over there and talked to him, and he said, you run pretty good. I said, I like the way you swing the bat too. He said, you interested in going to professional ball? I said, I sure am. He said, well, you'll get a contract this winter. So I went to started at Augusta.
Mel Blount was born on April the 10th of 1948, just outside the city limits of Vidalia on his father's farm. Attending Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, under a football scholarship, Blount was named Most Valuable Player in his junior year and All-Southwestern Athletic Conference 2 of his 4 years. Blount was drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers, where he played for 14 years before retiring in 1983. Blount played in 6 American Football Conference championships, was on the winning football Super Bowl teams of Super Bowls 9, 10, 13, and 14, played in 5 Pro Bowls, and voted Most Valuable Player in the 1976 Pro Bowl. In 1989, his first year of eligibility, he was inducted into the Professional Football Hall of Fame and the Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame. In 1990, he was inducted into the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame. Wanting to help troubled youngsters, Blunt founded the Mel Blunt Youth Home outside Vidalia in 1983, and then his second home in Claysville, Pennsylvania. Those close to Blunt say he enjoys himself most when he can bring a smile to youngsters in need of help. Born in 1932 in Toccoa, Georgia, Paul Anderson shook the weightlifting world when he outlifted the Russian weightlifting champion in 1955. Anderson awestruck the Russian audience when on his first attempt he lifted 77 pounds more than the Russian champion. Many Russians who witnessed the feat proclaimed Paul a wonder of nature. Some accounts claim some in the audience actually fainted. The Russians were correct in their description, for a year later he won the gold medal in Melbourne, Australia, and 2 years later raised 6,270 pounds off the ground in a back lift, exceeding the previous world record by 1,632 pounds. The Guinness Book of World Records recognizes the 6,270 pounds as the greatest weight ever lifted by a human. Many of the experts believe Paul Anderson is the strongest man who has ever walked the earth, and that future historians will still proclaim the same. Anderson's fame with weightlifting led Anderson not to the weightlifting career most would have taken, but rather Anderson dedicated his talents to raising money for a youth home he located in Vidalia in 1961. Anderson attributes his strength to Christ, and thus has dedicated his life and talents to helping others, namely youngsters in the need of help. Anderson talked with us about Vidalia's 100th birthday.
I want to give my appreciation and express it in a deep, sincere way to those that have worked to make Vidalia and Toombs County and the entire area such a fine place in which to live, and such a I don't want to sound like you're sitting around a campfire, but neighborly and receptive, and all the things that we would expect if we were looking for a place to raise a family.
We will end our documentary with a quick glimpse at Vidalia's Centennial celebration that took place during October of 1990. I would like to go ahead and thank all those responsible in making this video possible. I especially want to thank those who agreed to be interviewed and those who trusted me with their old photographs until they could be transferred to video. This video would not have been possible without the tremendous local interest and support that was present throughout the project.
Vidalia Centennial First Lady, B.B. Smith.
Centennial means 100 years of being. For 100 years we've been an established phase. There's so much in Vidalia.